So welcome everybody. This is our core module 3, obligation reporting. This session is going to be talking about submitting by ESF. My name is Mi-Ching Choi. I'll be your presenter today. And just a quick background about myself. I'm a consultant working for Resource Practices Branch. The person who's responsible for results, her name is Carolyn Wood. So she's not joining us in this session today, but if there's questions that I'm not able to answer, what will happen is I'll table those questions and I will get her to respond back, or I will find out the answers and I can email back to everybody. So today what's going to happen is if you've got questions, you can put up your hand if you have a microphone and I can turn the floor to you. I've muted everybody so that there's no background noise for interference during the session. If you are shy, you don't have a microphone, you can also ask your questions using the chat. But if you do use chat, please direct your questions to the entire audience so they may read the question. At the end of the session, there's an evaluation form. If you can complete the evaluation form, it will help us improve on our training delivery. Within 24 hours, you'll get an email regarding a test for results. If you're new to results, and a few of you are, if you don't have results access already, what will happen is that there's going to be a requirement to complete the test and pass it. What's going to happen is that you need to complete enough modules to be able to complete the test successfully. All of the test questions are based off the modules for training and the slide decks. So if you're not able to attend or watch the other sessions, you can peruse through the slide decks and get the baseline information to help you out with completing the test. So today is going to be a fairly long session, and we're going to be talking high-level information about results to refer you to core documentation you need to know about, talk about ESF, its genesis and what it means for submission, giving you an overview of the difference between submitting stuff online and ESF. We're going to be talking primarily about ESF. In dealing with submissions for ESF, you have to be familiar with also trying to figure out dealing with errors with submissions, and our technical documentation help you out with that. And then we're going to go and turn through the entire ESF submission components, and we'll go through actual excerpts of the actual ESF files and what they look like and how and what they mean. And then we'll talk about some data processing rules that you need to know about, and then just give you a high-level review about the submission process if you're absolutely new to actually submit to ESF into results. So business guidance. Results collects information about silviculture obligation openings. So what happens is that for these openings, there's legal requirements, and what happens is that we have a document called the Results Information Submission Specifications. There's various editions depending on what kind of submissions you're dealing with. For silviculture obligations, where there's a legal obligation to do reforestation, the edition that is used for major licensees is this licensee submission document. There's other documents that deals with things like government-funded activities, as well as woodlots and small-scale salvage. These are all located in the same location on the website. One thing to note about the submission specification is that recently there was changes to the requirement for forest cover reporting to have basal area a mandatory requirement. The details of that is highlighted in the document, but I just want to point to you that these documents that are on the website that speaks to the requirement for reporting, they do change from time to time, so you have to keep up to date on what's happening with the submission requirements. Basically for results, what's happened is that there's mandatory ESF that came into place back in 2005. So what happens is that now all the documents in terms of dealing with updating information and results, it's either coming through ESF or it's being updated online electronically by the submitter. So how this is important for you is that prior to this date, a lot of the documents that exist in results came through a paper-based format. So you will find that there are cases when you're looking at some of the documents, some information looks different than what are records that you would see today that are submitted based on the new standards. It's just because some of the information prior to this date had maps that were paper-based, for example, but then the information was never submitted electronically, so you'll find that the maps look like as if they're missing, but they're not. And in some situations, some of this information exists, but in a paper-based format, so it's like in a file format that is sitting in the district's office. But moving forward, all the submissions or all the updates are coming through electronically, so someone either has to log online or submit through ESF. So when we're talking about submitting through electronically, there's two ways of submitting information. There's ESF and online. Today's session, we're going to talk about ESF. One of the big key things about when we do ESF submission is this is the only way in which spatial information can come through results. So anytime when we have to do anything that supplies a map, so this would be creating a new opening where you have to supply a site plan map, or things like doing a force cover update where you have to provide a new force cover map, or dealing with standards unit modifications where you're supplying a new map because you're changing something like adding a standards unit, deleting a standards unit, or merging a standards unit. Anything spatial, it means you have to do it through ESF. So when we're dealing with submitting into results, what happens is that if you're new to the business, it can be quite a challenge to get used to understanding what needs to be done for dealing with submissions. On the website, we do have a location for technical documentation, which explains to you how results process information. So this technical documentation has information about the specifications, the schemas, as well as some other pieces of information that is just, depending if you're into running reports, understanding more information about results and how it processes information for openings. But really what is important is that when you're dealing with ESF, when you go into the technical documentation, there is a sort of a lookup for the ESF component, the electronic submissions, whereby this information is organized by the schema elements. And what happens is that when you're doing your submissions, what happens is that when errors come up, people often will look at the errors and then they are trying to decipher what caused this problem. Sometimes the errors tells you what data element caused an error. But then you have to dig a little bit deeper to figure out what are some of the rules that might have tripped up to cause the error. So by going into the technical documentation, what happens is that you're able to look up the specific data element that became a problem in the ESF error. And you will find information about the description of the field, as well as things like what the condition, whether it's optional, mandatory, or conditional, any default values, but more importantly, it has things like the validation rules. It's the validation rules that are being processed and reviewed when you're submitting the files. If there's a problem with the data, then that's when the errors come up. So I just point you to this technical documentation so you know where it is, what it is. So if you are encountering problems, this can be a go-to place for you to try to solve the problem in deciphering or fixing your submission. There are code lists that are available here, so depending on whether you're absolutely new to results, if you're not familiar with the codes, you have the ability to look up the codes through this online technical documentation as well. And finally, in the technical documentation, there is this thing called it's on the menu as an amendment update summary, but what it is it's just a matrix that explains to you how to submit information through ESF for dealing with standards unit modifications. Standards unit modifications are things like dealing with a correction, a minor amendment, a silviculture prescription amendment, an approved variation, and a site plan amendment, and then we also have Section 197 rollovers. What happens is that this matrix explains to you some of the processing rules involved so that you know how the schema gets processed, because if you're doing an SU modification, the data has to be set up in a particular manner in which it can process correctly, and there's some things that are allowed and not allowed. And so this matrix kind of gives you a summary of what kinds of things you can do based on the different standard unit actions you've chosen. I will go through this matrix and how it works in more detail in the subsequent modules, but this is just so that you understand at a very high level that there is a matrix that is available to help you out with deciphering how to set up your ESF submissions for SU modifications. So right now, for dealing with ESF submissions, the first thing you need to know about is that results allows you to create an ESF submission file where you have the option of setting up by individual opening, or it could be batched as multiple openings. You have a choice. But what's really important for you to know is that if you're new to results, we recommend that you create submissions individually by opening until you become familiar with the process and the requirements. So using the schematic as an illustration, if let's say I did create a multi-opening document and submitted that, this kind of shows you what happens if, let's say, you have 3 openings that you submitted. If there's some subcomponents to the opening that fails, then that means that that opening does not get submitted successfully. So if I had this one submission document that had openings 1, 2, and 3, if 2 and 3 had all the subsequent sections submitted and all the information that was provided had no problems, those openings number 2 and 3 would have passed, and then those openings would have been successfully updated through this ESF submission. But opening 1, because it had a problem with the disturbance report, that will mean that the opening 1 and all the information associated with it would have failed. So that means to fix this, you would have to fragment the actual opening 1 information, fix it, and then resubmit it individually. So this is just a simple illustration that if you were to stack a whole bunch of openings together in one submission, if you're not familiar with what you're doing and understanding some of the business and edit rules, if you do have a lot of errors and multiple openings, it can be quite cumbersome to try to fix them. But it's good for you to know that you can do individual opening or multiple openings, but you know what will happen if you do have subcomponents of the information that fails. You would then have to go back and address that one specific opening. So from the next slides onwards, we're going to start going through each of the submission components, and I'll speak to each of the components to explain what it does and things you need to watch out for. So first and foremost, the first piece of the ESF submission component is the metadata. And the metadata identifies you as a submitter and also information about the record in which you're going to be submitting for. So you will have to have information about what client number that you represent or the opening in which you're providing information for represents. And then you also provide some confirmation information about yourself. This information is important to have typed in correctly, because what will happen is that in the process of doing your ESF submission, should there be a problem with the errors are found, this information is used to ping back the email to give you the outcome of the submission document. So if there's errors, then having the right email is important, because you will not be notified if there was a problem. So it's really important to get that correctly. When you provide this metadata, it's also a way of authenticating who you are, because when you're doing your ESF submission, one of the first things you're going to end up doing online is you'll be required to enter in your IDER or your BCE ID account. So the combination of logging in to be able to submit your ESF file and the metadata that is supplied in the actual document, both are used to do a cross-check to authenticate whether or not you are authorized to submit for the district and for the client record that you're going to be providing. So that's the purpose of the metadata, is not only to identify who you are, but there's actually cross-checks to make sure that you have the authorization to be able to submit on behalf of the client that is in the ESF file as well as that district. The next piece in the opening definition is the key. And this illustration here shows 4 possible keys, but when you are providing or creating your document, you will only use 1 key. When we're dealing with a tenured opening, a new tenured opening, there's harvesting that's taken place, you have only 2 options available of the type of key you can use. You can use either the timber mark key, which is the combination of the timber mark cut block combination, or you can use the tenure key, which is the license cutting permit block combination. You can use either one of those, but not both. We do have the ability of using the opening number key or the opening ID key, but these are only useful when the opening has already been created. And so if you're trying to submit for an opening, and if you prefer to or need to, you could also use the opening ID number. But these opening number keys and opening ID keys are only for existing openings, but new records must have either the timber mark key or the tenure key, but not both. When you're creating a new opening, when you provide the timber mark or tenure key, what happens is that that information is actually used to cross-reference back against FTA to ensure that the tenure information you are providing is real. So one of the things that happens in the background when you're doing your submission of the files that's coming in, there's a lot of systematic checks that are happening to ensure that the ESF file is complete, the structure matches that of a results file, as well as some of the pieces of information. If it links to some other systems that the ministry has, there's data validation checks to ensure that the information is real, to make sure that there's good quality assurance that's taking place. So the opening definition has multiple usages. You can use it to create a new opening. You can update existing openings. You have the ability also to use it to do what we call an SU modification. So this is making a correction, minor amendment, major amendment, approved variation, or site plan amendment, or I should add also here a Section 197 rollover. But in the opening definition, depending on how you set up what we call the action code, it can do any of these things, and it's really the action code that will drive how results process the information. And in the opening definition, there's other pieces of information that supplied, things like the previous stand label, your standards unit information with the stocking standards regime ID, tenure information, as well as spatial information. At a high level, things that you need to know about is that when we're dealing with tenured openings, what will happen is you're going to be providing information about the tenure, and that information will be cross-referenced against FTA. And also, when the opening is created and it's successfully created in results, the information actually gets replicated nightly to Data BC. So there's a warehouse there where results information is published. So it's important for you to know that this information has multiple uses as well, so that the results data is published to this warehouse, whereby when you want to use things like map view, or if you're involved with doing any spatial analysis, results layers and information can be ordered to, you can actually get dumps of data from the warehouse for results data. So this information is available for other clients as well to use. So for the opening definition, what is in the definition, there's this previous stand label information, as well as information about the maximum allowable permanent access percentage. And then we also have this thing called the site plan exempt indicator, which tells the system whether or not we're supplying information for a silviculture prescription or a site plan. For any new records that are now coming into results, what's happening is that we are only seeing site plans come in. The only time when we see a site plan exempt indicator set to yes is a silviculture prescription, and the only time that that's going to happen is that if we're doing a standard unit modification. situation to a silviculture prescription. And I'll talk about this in the next slide. But this site plan exemption indicator has a very specific use to inform the system whether we're dealing with a site plan or silviculture prescription. We have the opening category code, which is a code that sort of high level sort of defines what kind of silviculture obligation we're dealing with. And then we have this place called the action code, which is really crucial because when we have the opening definition, action codes tell the system whether you're creating a new record. So I insert is for new openings, and then if we have other codes, we have U for updates, and that's like also for correction. We have A for amendments, M for minor amendments, and V for approved variation. So there is an O for opening amalgamation, except I don't think ESF allows for ESF opening amalgamations. But what happens is that this action code is important because it tells the system what is this data file, how it's going to be processed, and that kind of trickles downwards to how this information gets reflected in the system. So going back to that site plan exempt indicator again, what happens is that in the schema, so really this is just an example of what the schema looks like if you were to actually put together an ESF file. What happens is that part of the schema will have this site plan exempt indicator field, and it defaults to N, so meaning that majority of the time we're going to see a document that refers to a standards unit that's a site plan. It's only when we have to do something to a silviculture prescription where you set this site plan exempt indicator to yes, in which case what happens is that the processing rules of what information is expected to be provided for the standards unit will vary. So a site plan, for example, will have standards unit identifier and you'll have an approved standards regime ID. But when you have a silviculture prescription, you will end up with a document with the standards unit with all the detailed elements of the stocking standard included. So, for example, it'll be things like the target stocking, the minimum preferred stocking, minimum stocking, preferred and acceptable species. All those different elements would be expected to be provided in the document itself. So really the site plan exempt indicator is just to tell the system, am I going to process information about a silviculture prescription or a site plan amendment and nothing else? In the past, some people get confused with this, thinking that, oh, is this a silviculture obligation? Is this because there is a silviculture obligation or no silviculture obligation for the standards unit? And it's nothing about that. It's really about how the system processed the document to determine whether we're dealing with the document as a site plan based on edit rules or a silviculture prescription based on what is required as far as the data elements expected. Another thing you need to know about is that when we create a new opening, there is edit checks that are in place. So one of the things that it's going to always expect as a part of a new opening, an insert new opening coming in, must have always at least one standards unit in the opening definition. And this is to ensure data integrity. So when we have a legal obligation, you have to have a standards unit and one standards unit as a minimum. And this is important because the standards unit is used to help. It's basically the basic building block of defining your net area to be reforested. It also has the information about the regeneration and free growing due years, and that is what is used to calculate the regeneration and free growing due dates. I know for FERPA it's a default to 20 years, but the information still needs to be provided to help generate the due dates. So the next component of the opening definition is the tenure data. So this is different than the key that we talked about earlier at the very beginning. The tenure data section is really to allow the licensee to decide which cut blocks are associated with the opening. Results allows for multi-cut block openings. It is possible to have one or more cut blocks. So if that is the situation, what happens is that this is the location in the submission where you provide all those different cut blocks that is associated with the opening. When we have just a one cut block opening, what will happen is that the opening, the key that's used at the very beginning of the opening definition and this tenure key would be the same. where there will always be one prime license indicator set to yes, true. If we have a multi-cut block opening, what happens is that you'll have more than one cut block appearing, and the prime that you choose will be true, is the one that will appear in the results tombstone, and the other cut blocks associated with the opening will be false, meaning that they're non-prime. And what happens is that they will still appear in the tenure section of in the multi-tenure tab in results. You can still see that, but what will happen is that the prime or the true prime license indicator one will be the sort of one that will be referred to for the opening identifier. So the other component to the opening definition is the standards unit. Again, there must be at least one standards unit for the opening definition. And what happens is that in the opening definition now, all the new records that are coming in are site plans. So the site plan exempt indicator is default to N. And what happens is that you provide the information about the standards unit. It could be one or more, with the net area to be reforested and the biogeoclimatic zone classification for the standards unit. You have the maximum allowable soil percentage, soil disturbance percentage, and then you have the standards regime ID. So the standards regime ID is an approved stocking standard for use that is approved for use in either, depending on what record we're dealing with. So now it would be all FSPs. So these regime IDs will appear in a licensee's FSP. But these regime IDs have to be approved for use for the district and the client that matches the record that we're submitting for. So these are sort of just those edit checks that are in place. So if you provide a number, a standards regime ID that belongs to some other licensee, or you mistyped the wrong standards regime that happens to not exist, the system will give you an error. So it has to be approved for use for the client and for the org unit that this tenure information that you're providing belongs to. So there's all these validation checks that are happening in results. So the standards regime must be approved for use, and unless in some situations some people are using ministry defaults, right? So some of the ESF submission for government funded activities, they use ministry defaults. So, but the standards regime must be approved for use for the client or unit, or it's a ministry default. And again, there's validation checks that are happening, and when the information is successful, all this information gets replicated into the warehouse. And there's this check against to make sure the standard regime is approved for use through the tracking system as well. And lastly, for the opening definition, we have the spatial data. So what happens is that you have the opening spatial and you have the standards unit spatial, and that's a requirement. So this would be akin to the site plan map. So you have an opening boundary and a standards unit boundary that's provided as a part of the opening definition. So this is just some illustrations of how some of the boundaries may appear as it's being submitted into results. Is very conceptual. A lot really depends on how the site plans are developed and what kind of silvicultural systems are being used and what the net area is. So they're just illustrative. And these are directly pulled from the results information submission specification documents. So you have a sense of where all the stuff is coming from. So opening definition, we have this sort of patch cut here, where the way this opening was defined, you have the opening boundary that matches that of the standards unit boundary. This other one, we have some, sort of more, patch cuts that are happening throughout. But then in this case, the definition of the opening boundary is the red outline with the standards unit, which is the cut area, in green, and that's defined as the standards unit boundary. So how these are defined depends on how that site plan is developed, right? So it varies depending on how what silvicultural system is used. So that's the opening definition. And then the next component we're going to talk about is the submission, disturbance submission. And so really the disturbance submission is to create either new disturbance or you have the ability to update an existing disturbance. But majority of the time, most people are just submitting a new disturbance report. In the disturbance report, we have information about the disturbance code, silvicultural systems, harvest start, completion dates, disturbance area, and there's the ability to provide spatial information. Disturbance spatial map you can provide that, but it's optional. So I don't talk about the legislation here, but stepping back, what happens is that when we have reporting that takes place for a silviculture obligation, upon harvest completion, what happens is that the requirement is to provide report for the opening definition, as well as opening component. So you have to sort of define the opening, and then we have to provide the standards unit, and we have to also provide disturbance report, and then also a forest cover report that represents the actual harvested area. So this disturbance report typically comes with the opening definition report, because usually it's upon harvest completion. So a lot of this stuff is all combined as one file for the opening. So when we have the disturbance report, what happens is that some of this information is used to also update FTA for showing information about the disturbance area, dates, and also changes the cut block status. So there's this kind of rippling of information that comes in through results, but results talks to FTA to provide some information back to that system to indicate that there's been some activity on the results reporting side. And again, all this information comes in, the information gets duplicated to the warehouse. And also the harvest completion report is one of the triggers that indicates to vegetation inventory that something's happened on the land base. So with this disturbance report that comes in initially, it then expects to see something coming in for the forest cover side, because it uses the information coming in from results for forest cover to help update the vegetation inventory. So when we have the disturbance report, what happens is that there's the information that comes in that is about the disturbance. So this is the code, silvicultural system, start, end dates, and disturbance gross area. This harvest complete on the cut block indicator set to true if the cut block is finished with the harvesting. And this action code, I, is for inserts. Majority of the time for any new disturbance reporting, people use I for supplying the new update for a new disturbance report. What happens too is when we have disturbance reports, if we have multiple tenures, you need to provide the cut block information for the harvesting. But if there's more than one cut block, you have to stratify the reporting to reflect each of the different tenure that exists for the opening. Likewise, if there's more than one silvicultural system that is being used for the opening, then what happens is that the silvicultural system area that's being used has to be split up for each of the individual silvicultural system that applies to the opening. So there is the ability to supply splitting up of disturbance reports, and you stratify based on either tenures, if there's multiple tenures, or silvicultural system if there's different silvicultural systems. So again, in the results information submission specification, it gets into more detail about this, but when we do the reporting, it's disturbance gross area, and in the document it says anything that's gross area minus the MP net and reserves, undisturbed reserves, is the disturbance area. And so it's the sum of it's basically this area that becomes what is reported in the disturbance gross area. And so again, you should just go back to the document to sort of to distinguish what is calculated as part of the disturbance area. And the idea here is it's just the disturbance gross area that gets reported. And for the next component we have is the silviculture activity submission, where in this case you have the ability of providing new silviculture activities or updating existing ones. Majority of the time you're also just providing new activities. It's really just a few examples with government funded where they'll update existing activities. But majority of the time licensee supplies what's been completed and they use an insert function. When you're dealing with silviculture activity reporting, you're providing information about the type of silviculture treatment that was completed, the completion date, the area treated, and there's the opportunity to provide spatial information. Again, the spatial information is optional for activity reporting. However, in some situations for government-funded activities, spatial maps are required. And so for this would be like government-funded activities for aerial fertilization and juvenile spacing. So what happens is that the spatial maps are they have a very specific time when they have to be provided, and really they're primarily tied to government-funded activities. What happens again when all the silviculture activities are completed, the information is replicated in the warehouse. In the case of dealing with planting reports, what happens is that there's additional information that's a mandatory requirement. Like the planting report would comprise of things like the species information, total trees planted, and seed lot information. There's validation that's taking place against the seed lot information to ensure that the information exists in SPAR. So this is just an excerpt of what the silviculture activity piece would look like. So there's different coding that represents the different base technique method activities. So you can look those up in the results code lists if you're not familiar with the different code lists that exist for the different activities you may need to be able to describe. The idea here is that base technique method are mandatory fields, and then what happens is there's a funding source code. And the other big key thing for you to know about is in the schema, there is a field called the actual date indicator. And this indicator is set to true or false. By setting this indicator, it tells results whether you're providing a planned or completed activity. So if this indicator is set to true, it means that you're supplying information about a completed activity. False means it's a planned activity. So all the content information may be the same, but just from toggling this from true to false will have a different meaning between a completed or false, completed or a planning activity that's being supplied to results. You also provide the area treated, and so that's basically sort of the baseline mandatory information that's supplied. As I was saying before, if we have a planting activity, what happens is that the information is different in that there's this additional information that needs to be supplied about the planting stock. So you may have one or more planting stock provided, because if there's different species with different seed lots, then each individual seed lot species need to be included as a part of the document. So the thing here to note is that when you're providing planting information, there's going to be the enforcement requiring that species information is provided as well as seed lot information or seed lot, veg lot information. And when the lot number is provided, that there's that cross-check against SPAR to ensure that the seed lot number that you provided is real, so it's registered seed lot, so that this enables that we have good data integrity between the lot information and results against SPAR. And if there's any exceeding of transfer limits, then that information is also included. So that's silviculture reporting. And then the next piece is about forest cover reporting. And I guess what I wanted to step back is that the forest cover reporting that comes in the results comes from surveys, silviculture surveys. So what happens is that out in the field, they're out there measuring these stands to meet different requirements, whether it's post-harvest regeneration or free growing. And what happens is that it's other steps in play that collects the information that is then summarized, that becomes the force cover information that we see in results. So what happens is that while the results information submission specification provides the guidelines of what needs to be provided, the data collection happens out in the field. And so if there's information that's coming in that's incomplete from the force cover perspective, that's not meeting results requirement, then you have to go back a few steps and look at, well, how is this information collected in the field, and is it complete to meet the requirements of the submission requirements? So I just step back to let you know that there's this other process in play in the field that is and then what happens is that the information that comes from results is a byproduct. And so if there's a problem with force cover information coming in, you might have to go back a few steps and talk to the counterparts that are involved with the data capture for the field data capture component. So force cover is extremely complicated, and more recently there was an update to the results information submission specification where there was a change in requiring basal area reporting. So it's important for you to go into the documents to review those. But the idea here is that the report information specification goes into all the different components that I'll be talking about here, but it also speaks to what is the details about what is required and things that you need to know about. So force cover is very detailed, and there's a lot of edit checks. And I go back to this technical documentation website where when you do have problems with force cover reporting, it's probably a good idea to go back and reference back to the technical specification to find out more information about any of the problem area that you might have encountered. A lot of the force cover edit checks that are currently in play in results are really tied to ensuring improved data quality for VRIMs. And this is our vegetation inventory. VRIMs is Vegetation Resource Inventory Management System, where it is a system that goes in and looks up a lot of the force cover information that results captures, and then there's a process where the force cover information that comes in for inventory then is used to update the vegetation inventory. It's somewhat automatic, but if there's errors or issues with some of the data quality that's coming in, there's actual people that have to go through and do some quality assurance checks, validations, etc., to try to decipher problematic records that are coming in. So what we've done is that we've put some of those edit checks to ensure good data coming through to some degree, but by no means do we have all the checks in place. But the complexity of the force cover checks is really to help serve not only for the data integrity for results itself, but also to ensure that some of this information, or try to make sure as much of this information is used to help update vegetation inventory to make sure that information is coming as clean as possible. So for force cover submissions, what happens is that there's four main data components. At the very highest level, we have the polygon data. And what the polygon data is that it's describing the polygons in the opening, and it has information about the polygon identifier, the polygon area, survey year, which is the reference year, and if there is a reserve, then it's described using the combination of the reserve type and objective codes. And information, if applicable, it's information about the site index and site index source, and then stocking status and stocking type. Again, that results information submission specification helps out with detailing this stuff out in a lot of structure and detail for you. One of the things you need to know about is that when you're dealing with any force cover submissions, there's an edit rule in the system that will disallow you from submitting a force cover report into results unless there's a disturbance report. So this is a edit rule that's in place to ensure that disturbance report exists, because what happens is that from a business perspective, the milestone dates are triggered by the first disturbance harvest start date. And without that disturbance report, what happens is that we don't know what the milestone start date is. So what happens is that to ensure that we have good data integrity, we made sure that when force cover comes in, there has to be a disturbance report that comes in at the same time with that initial force cover report, or the disturbance report already exists. So that's an edit rule that sometimes some people encounter. The other thing that you need to be aware of is that when we talk about force cover submissions, what happens is that the force polygons, spatial data they're required. So whenever we're talking about force cover, there's a mandatory spatial component that's being supplied. So it's something for you to just know that when we talk about force cover, there's a map, and so ESF and also the spatial component must be provided for all the polygons. We have these reserve type codes and reserve objective codes, and they are used to help describe the type of treat retention reserve areas in terms of the spatial distribution, as well as the temporal aspect of whether it's a short-term or long-term reserve. If you're new to force cover reporting, we have a module 8 that explains a little bit more about this tree retention component and how it's described. But if you're not able to attend the module, we do have a document that actually describes it in very detailed format, and you need to be familiar with that to ensure that the force cover, if there's any tree retention reserve component to it, that it's described accurately. And there's a document on the website that will help you out with that. The next thing about force cover reporting is we have polygons, but in a lot of cases, if we're dealing with a standards unit or we're dealing with information where there's a requirement to submit inventory or silviculture component, then this is reflected in the layer data that is within results. So how the layer component appears will vary depending on whether we're dealing with an even age stand or a multi-layer stand, and how it's reported again goes back to really about the survey methodology that was used at the time to collect this information. So by the time the stuff comes to being submitted to results, how the data structure has been pretty much predefined by the survey methodology and how the information that's been supplied to create this ESF file. But the layer information provides information about densities, basal area, species and age and height information. And so depending on what kind of stand structure you have and the circumstances, the type and how you describe the layer will vary. So there's inventory component, silviculture component, and you can have multi-layer component for inventory and silviculture as well. So again, that's reflected based on the survey methodology that's employed and how the information is described. If there is the existence of damage agent, then the ability to add that to the polygon is available at the layer level. The other pieces that you need to know about when you deal with force cover submission is that force cover is a complete replacement for the opening. So you can't just update one polygon. While only one polygon may be updated from a survey perspective, what has to happen is that the entire opening must be submitted. So the label or the component of the surveyed polygon can be updated in the attribute, and the other parts that haven't been surveyed can stay as is, but the entire opening and that information needs to be supplied to results. And the reason is that the way results is set up, this information is used by vegetation inventory, and they're operating on a complete opening replacement rule. So if you don't update the entire opening, it would actually cause the vegetation inventory to create spatial data gaps. So that's a really key piece for you to note, is that when we deal with openings, you provide a submission for the entire opening only if a subset of that has changed. It's just that label with the survey information gets updated, but the remaining other pieces still get submitted with the spatial, with the existing label that's there, even though there was new survey, but it goes out as a submission as a whole. The last component is this non-mappable component. And so what happens is that in some situation, we have small little dispersed areas within the polygon that are non-mappable, but the sum of the areas do amount to be something somewhat substantial. So if there is a need to identify these non-mappable areas that are dispersed throughout the opening or the polygon, what will happen is that you have the ability of identifying the sum of these non-mappable areas and describe them through the stocking status and type and the area. And then that gets netted out of the polygon gross area. So this non-mappable area is used by some that want to reflect more accurately what's the net area to be reforested, because of some of these non-productive areas or dispersed areas, rocks, it could be a variety of different kinds of blotches within the polygon. You want to be able to reflect them to net that out of your net area for the forest cover polygon. And then the last piece is the spatial. So each polygon will have a spatial component that represents that polygon area. So the sum of all this will be like for all the polygons, so that it will be representing the opening. So here we've got some very high level examples of forest cover submissions, and these are in the actual there's examples of these in the risk guide. And so what happens is that you've got different examples of different cuts where, depending on how it's stratified, we have the A as a cut over area that represents a standards unit, and that becomes a polygon unto itself. B would be mature, so this would be classified as a reserve of some sort. And then we have the roads and landings that are identified as NP-UN. So these are just high-level conceptual of how the forest cover could get stratified, and it goes back to how the site plan was set up, right? So here we have this variable retention area where that A is the entire standards unit, and then what happens, we have the NP-UN as the road that gets reported. And then in this one example on the right, we have two different silvicultural systems where we've got a clear cut and a seed tree, and they're set up as two different standards unit. So stratification happens within the polygons based on standards unit, as well as other rules based on species composition. And what happens is that these polygons are broken up to what they need to describe the different land types that they have, stand types that they have. And then we have Cs as reserves, and then the NP-UN. So a lot of this forest cover stratification is based on the site plan standards unit, as well as perhaps the silvicultural systems that were used, and then also the stand conditions. So it, again, defaults to really the silviculture surveys and what kind of standards they set in terms of how things need to be stratified. So when you are involved with dealing with forest cover submissions, you'll find that there's going to be a lot of validation rules, a lot of data interdependency. And that's just to try to create some standards in place to improve data quality. A lot of this stuff is explained in the submission specification documents, and some of it is explained in the ESF technical specification. So it's really important for you to be familiar with both of these. And I guess the other part here is that for the force cover submissions, we have a lot of checks, but not all the checks. And then some of the stuff has to be uh, relying on the professional who's submitting, reviewing this information to ensure that it's complete. So while we have a lot of data checks in place, it doesn't always confirm all the legal requirements. So the onus is on the submitter to make sure that they know what is it that they're submitting and it makes sense to them and it's complete, because it would be a very nasty chore to try to do edit checks for all the possible scenarios, and probably it'd be really painful to try to set that up in a way that it doesn't hinder submissions from coming through, because there's always exception to the rules. So it's really important, if you're involved doing these submissions, to know what the requirements are and to make sure that document you are submitting makes sense and is complete. The next component of the submission is milestones, and so you have the ability of submitting milestones through ESF. And when we deal with milestone submissions, you need to provide information about the standards unit, the milestone type, declaration date, and you have the capability also supplying a comment. So the comment is really important if you're dealing with declarations where there's some sort of special scenario that applies the 97.1 or relief of obligation. Or in some cases, earlier on, there was a question about, do I only have, who can declare, and what if the submitter isn't a registered professional? Submitters can submit on behalf of the licensee, but whoever that's doing the declaration has to be the registered professional. And so what happens is that quite often the submission will contain the information of who is the declaration, who did do the actual declaration, so that there's that reference point. So this comment component provides the ability to, provide a lot of extra information if there's requirement to do so. As well, there is the ability to attach information online in results. If there's supplemental information that's important to have included as a part of the opening file. But what helps is that if you do have things that are in the attachment that ties to things like the declaration, make a note of that in the comment as well, so that whoever that's in a reviewer's role realizes that there's other supplemental document that they may need to refer to that is enhanced by the that helps provide the supplemental information that is adjoining with the declaration that is meaningful, that someone needs to refer to. The other thing too is that when we deal with milestone declarations, that in the legislation, when there is a free-growing declaration that takes place, there is a requirement to supply the free-growing force cover information. But what has happened is that results will allow you to do a milestone declaration, but it doesn't do an auto check to say, hey, this force cover exists. And that's just because we have force cover coming through a lot of different parts of the life cycle of the opening. And so what happened is that we never really hardwire results to do this last check to say, hey, your free-growing force cover isn't there. Because again, it gets really onerous to try to program the system to check for every single legal requirement. So the responsibility is on the declaration or the submitter or whoever that's doing the declaration to make sure that they have checked and confirmed that the force cover information for free-growing has been supplied before the declaration is taking place or at the same time of the declaration. So this is a good example where the system is not enforcing that legal requirement, but the responsibility is on the submitter to make sure that the information is supplied. So as said, there's the ability of adding information online if there's a need to supply supplemental information. So what happens is that for doing this, it's not ESF. You have to go and log into results and then go into the attachment tab and then add any information that you may want. And if it's tied to anything like a standards unit modification or a declaration, it's useful to make sure that you add some information in the comment or rationale field to explain there's supplemental information that's located in the attachment for reference sake. So I talked about this already, mandatory legal requirement versus edit checks. So the starting point is this results information submission specification document. It speaks to the mandatory requirements, the legal components of what's required. And so that's the starting point. And results provide some rudimentary checks, systems checks for data quality, data dependency, but I can't check for all those legal requirements because there's so many nuances and interpretation required in so many different scenarios that we have already that's in the system. And so what happens is that the responsibility is on the submitter to make sure that the data that's being supplied to results is consistent with the legal requirements. So when you are encountering errors and problems with your submissions, what is being checked systematically can be referred through the results technical specification webpage. So the last few slides relates to ESF submission process. Everyone's on a different system in terms of if they're working with a ministry versus BCTS versus a licensee company that has a proprietary software. Their system and how to submit to results will appear different because it might be seamless where they push a button, the stuff just gets pushed into results automatically. What I'm showing you is if you are actually going through online and you need to refer to ESF or submit a file manually through results, this is the steps that you would have to go through, but maybe many of you might not even need to do this. But I show this just so that you know about it. So in results, when you log on, under data submission, you go into the XML submission component, and then you're taken to this ESF framework. What happens is that if you're involved with doing a submission, you have to select upload submission, where you're then into this upload submission screen. This upload submission screen has one of many different ESF schemas based on what you're submitting to. There's one for the FSP tracker, there's one for cutting permits, and there's one for results. So results is opening submission, and you have to select that. And what happens is that this then identifies what is the format or the schema that it's going to be checking when you're supplying that file, that ESF file. You provide some user reference to the file, and then you link or attach the file that you have as the ESF file that you've generated, and you hit upload. And what happens is that the first thing that happens is you get this next confirmation submission screen that appears. And what happens is that this email is what is defaulted from that ESF opening definition, or actually it's from the metadata information that appears. So this has to be correct, or else it'll send to some weird email. If you have a typo, it'll send to that. So, if you need to make sure that that's always done correctly. And at this point, when it says submission validated, all it's doing is that it's comparing the opening submission document against your submitted document, comparing the structure to make sure that it makes sense and there's no real big gross errors. So sometimes if you don't select the right submission, you put tracker or FSP instead of opening submission, the document you have is meant for a result submission. They won't match up and you'll get gross errors and they would appear here. But if there's no errors, it seems like the submission is validated. It says structure is okay, and that's it. And then you hit finalize submission, and then you get this complete submission, and then you get an email saying the submission successfully queued. At this point, your submission is not done. It's now sitting in a queue yet to be processed. So right now, all you've done is met some very coarse checks to make sure the structure of the file is correct, no weird errors that have occurred. But until this is complete with the queue, the submission isn't in the system yet, so nothing's been done yet. It's not until you get and you'll get pinged this email when things are done saying that your opening is received, or you can go back to the search button and look up the opening submission you created and it says it's accepted, and then that means that the opening has been submitted and there's no problems with it, and then you have the information about which opening, if it's a new opening that was created. So that's the steps that are involved with dealing with submissions. Should you have errors with your submission, what will happen is that you'll get a status rejected, and then you get these interesting notes about what opening and what kind of error you have, and then you have to go back and then figure out what went wrong. So that goes back to the very beginning. If you're new to doing ESF submission, it makes things a lot easier if you have it separated out by opening, so that you can actually figure it out individually versus trying to decipher through which ones failed, which one passed, and then trying to split up your submissions to fix them individually afterwards. So, but it's a personal choice, and some licensees have their system set up in a certain way, and because it's all internal, they have enough checks to submit multiple openings and they won't have a problem. But if you're trying to build this stuff individually and you're new to it, you may have to, make a choice of how you want to structure your submissions. So that pretty much concludes my session today. And so there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. But before anyone goes, just to let you know that we do have a help application support tab in results, whereby if you have problems, there's ability for you to search out your questions and see whether or not there's been, responses to those questions on your own. And then there's district contact people you can reach. And if all else fails, there is our application support people that can help you out with your questions. We do have other training available. If you're not able to attend our sessions that we're offering, there's recordings and other modules, slide decks that are available for you, so that you're able to read through those on your own.